Now, an offer on the table from President Obama to Republicans to avoid what we're calling here on the show the fiscal curb. Despite being the only plan on the table, the proposal was instantly derided by Republicans as not serious.
That offer yesterday was simply not serious.
I mean, it was not a serious proposal. And so right now we're almost nowhere.
The White House plan would proceed in two stages. The first would include $1.6 trillion in additional tax revenue through an immediate increase in the top two marginal tax rates, in addition to capital gains and dividends increases, and around $600 billion in deduction limits for the wealthy. It also includes $50 billion in new stimulus funds, an extension of unemployment insurance, a mortgage refinancing program, and interestingly, a proposal not only to raise the debt ceiling, but end Congress's ability to stop increases in the debt limit unless they have a two-thirds majority to bypass a veto. In the second phase would come $350 billion in reforms to what the White House calls entitlement programs, and we here on the show call social insurance. Not surprisingly, this is the least specific part of the proposal, making clear to Republicans that if they want cuts to social insurance, they are going to have to propose them. Yesterday, Speaker John Boehner once again refused to outline any specific cuts when asked about what cuts Republicans want in social insurance.
Look at our budget from the last 2 years, and there are plenty of specific proposals, most of which were part of the conversation that the president and I had 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago. There have been discussions about many of those same issues this time. So there's a lot from the conversations that we've had to inform almost anybody the kind of proposals that we're looking for.
Joining us now are Sam Seder, host of the podcast Majority Report on Majority.fm, and Donahue Peebles, a member of President Obama's National Finance Committee and the chairman and CEO of the Peebles Corporation. Great to have you here.
Great to be here.
So there's the proposal on the table, which I think is pretty good. And I just want to talk about the political dynamics here because they're kind of hilarious to me. Sam, what is your reaction to the reaction of Republicans to this proposal?
It's pretty funny. I mean, because I think like they are really in a tough position now because the president is playing a different game than he's been playing in the past, and he's basically saying to the Republicans, if you want to cut Medicare, if you want to propose any cuts to social insurance programs, let's hear it.
Right.
And the Republicans don't want to do that. They have had success in the past on running against Democrats when Democrats make the cuts that Republicans want them to make. And they were successful on that in 2010. They tried to do it in 2012 with less success. And now it's not on the table. And, you know, I don't have a sense of necessarily what's going on in the White House, but it seems to be more of an agenda that is more aligned with congressional Democrats. They're the ones who are going to have to run in 2 years, and they don't want to run on having cut Medicare. And they're basically saying to the Republicans, if this is what you want, bring it.
I think the politics of this are fascinating because it was so. We just had a whole election in which one of the main themes of the election was each party's candidate saying that the other party's candidate was the guy who really wanted to take the hatchet to Medicare or had already taken the hatchet to Medicare. This was intensely litigated. And then we have the election, and then we all come together for our fiscal curb negotiations, and everyone's saying, so do you want to be the one to tell them that we're going to take the hatchet to Medicare, even though the fact is people do not want Medicare to be cut?
Well, no, I think what you see is the president advancing his agenda, what he articulated in the campaign, which is fighting for middle-class tax cuts. And he's now saying, instead of being the balanced president, I think that we saw in the first term, he's now saying, okay, here's our agenda. Now, Republicans, your agenda is spending cuts. Okay, propose them. Let's see what they are. And that's, you know, I think the right approach for the president in the short term politically. But ultimately, what happens is the Republicans are going to be reluctant to propose cuts. So that brings us more likely or closer to this fiscal cliff, which I think is more of a molehill than a mountain. But I think that that's where we may end up, and I think we may see some more drama as a result of that.
Reluctant to raise taxes, but I'm cautiously optimistic that I'm seeing some people pull away from Grover Norquist and actually hold on to the mantle of Reagan, and that Reagan raised taxes, and then Corker from Tennessee saying, well, I'm not beholden to Grover Norquist or to the pledge, I'm beholden to my constituency. So I actually see a little bit of movement here in terms of raising revenue. Now, the cutting of programs, that's going to be a different story.
Yeah, I don't think anybody wants to cut programs, obviously, and the Republicans don't, because they're now in what they consider the rebuilding mode. But the challenge is going to be that there are Democrats. So if you take a look at some of these tax issues, for example, estate taxes, the president is not going to have unified support from the House on that issue because he's going to lose most likely the Congressional Black Caucus. He's going to lose representatives of farming states because it's going to decimate
It is not going to decimate.
Well, actually,
that is an absolute ridiculous overstatement.
Let's think about it this way. Let's look at it from African Americans' perspective. Hundreds of years of oppression. Finally, there's an opportunity to go and compete in a balanced way in this economy today. But there's a head start. And so of generational transferring of wealth. And so finally now, with equality that's taken place since the Civil Rights Movement, you have a more alignment of wealth. And now it's going to be wiped out by 55%.
Such an infinitesimally small number of people. I mean, literally, we could fit all of the people you're talking about probably in this room.
You're talking about African Americans in the United States who are subject to the estate tax?
I'm not arguing the actual merits of the issue. I'm telling you the politics of it. The Congressional Black Caucus voted with George Bush the last time around on estate taxes.
We're going to talk about the politics of it.
By the way, and they are again.
If we're going to talk about the politics of it, let's be explicit. We're talking about multi-millionaires. We're not talking about African American populations.
We're talking about job generators, small business owners.
Multi-millionaires, people who have over $10 million, $5 million as an individual to pass on to their children, and don't want to be taxed on every dollar above that amount. We're not talking about African Americans. We're not talking about any other subgroups. We're talking about multi-millionaires who represent point. Yes, but the politics are who's giving money to those politicians.
No.
Because we're talking about 0.02% of the population.
The Congressional Black Caucus voted with George Bush, and that's why you saw a dramatic cut in estate taxes and no increase in estate taxes. I'm telling you that the political dynamics.
Wait a second.
But if you want to argue the point, we can argue the point on the filibuster rule and what the merits of that are. We can argue.
But that's the point.
But it's political reality. Political reality of what's going to happen later on this month or next month. What's going to happen? What's really
the argument you're making is that the president cannot get the votes he needs for the revenue he's proposing. Is that the point?
No, I think that he's going to have some drama, and there's going to be some disagreement within the Democratic caucus, and one of them is going to be estate taxes because that is one of the major points of the tax increase.
The other places, very wealthy people are behind the push to repeal tax. That's the politics of it. It may be the case that he has to give that up because the power of money trumps these other things, but that's the politics.
The last time around, the swing was the Congressional Black Caucus. And that's what took the Democrats because of the Democrat issue.
The other place that I think that they're going to have internal caucus dissent is if this proceeds in a way. Right now, there's $350 billion in cuts to Medicare that are on the table. That's the sort of initial offer bid. And I want to talk about the politics of that very, very politically dangerous topic right after this. All right, so there's the tax side of this, and I think we're seeing some erosion on that, and we're going to sort of dive deeper into the taxes tomorrow. But then there's the cut side. Okay, the sequester is in place right now that was previously agreed to. It's going to be 1.2 trillion in cuts, and the idea is to replace that with other cuts because the cuts that have been agreed to are such a blunt instrument. Okay. I want to focus on the Medicare portion because I have to say the consensus right now in Washington, and I was cheered to see the president's opening bid, but the consensus in Washington is that we got to come up with a grand bargain, ... we got to do something about entitlements. This is the big thing, something about entitlements. And I just don't understand why that's the case. And the reason I don't understand why that's the case is the big problem is the rate of growth of healthcare costs. I think we could all agree on that, right?
Yep.
Now, Medicare, the rate of growth in Medicare is significantly lower than the rate of growth of healthcare costs in the private sector. So it's doing a better job of controlling costs relative to the private sector. Then we just passed a huge bill that was incredibly contentious, which is called the Affordable Care Act, the vast majority of the legislative language of which is about controlling costs in healthcare over the future. And so it seems to me like the reasonable thing to do is to wait 4 years, 5 years, implement the bill, and see if the cost control measures that have been put in place, fought about tooth and nail, not like, smuggled in the cover of night, like hugely, hugely controversial, whether those cost containment methods work. And then, we can all sit at this table 5 years from now. And I don't understand why this isn't just the opening position of Democrats. And as someone who's on the Hill, shouldn't that be the opening position?
Well, yes.
Thank you. Well said.
Yeah, I want to back it up for just a minute, if I could, and go back to where we started with talking about what the president's put on the table. I think what we're looking at here now is a president that's been reelected. He's newly empowered. The Republican minority has been saying for several weeks now, why won't the president stand up and lead? We need the president to lead.
Right,
well, he stood up. Right. He's put the proposal on the table, and what do they say now? Basically, they say, well, tell us how you're going to compromise with us before we engage with you, which, unfortunately, I think
has been some of the precedent in the past.
In the early, yeah.
Getting back to your original question, I think, frankly, it has to do the same thing as to why we're debating maintaining historically low estate taxes. It's money. Right. There is absolutely no reason in terms of the budget to be even talking about Social Security. And in terms of Medicare, it's the exact same thing. I'm sure there are cuts that can be made in terms of efficiencies. Particularly when it comes to pharmaceuticals, there's a lot of savings there. I mean, we have the prescription D, the Medicare D, where we are not negotiating for volume discounts with pharmaceutical industries. Same thing in other parts of Medicare. So there's a lot of savings to be there, close to $300 billion, I think, over 10 years. But the real bottom line is I think those people who want to attack Social Security want this money to end up on Wall Street.
And there's an extremely well-funded group of people. We'll talk about fix the debt. We'll play you the fix the debt ad, and we'll talk about some of the interest behind that right if we take a break.